Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the AST podcast. We've got a fascinating episode today on the environment and the ethical implications of social upheaval brought about by ecological catastrophe. We've got two amazing guests. We've got Cathy Driscoll, who's a professor at the Sobey School of Business at St. Mary's University, who's chair of the Halifax-Yarmouth Diocesan Council for Development and Peace, Caritas Canada, and a certified Laudato Si animator with the Global Catholic Climate Movement. We also have Rob Currie. Rob Currie is a professor in the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University, specialising in international and transnational criminal law. His book, International and Transnational Criminal Law, was shortlisted for the Walter Owen Book Prize for Outstanding Legal Literature in 2011. He is also one of Atlantic Canada's finest singer-songwriters.
That's high praise.
I read that in a Moncton newspaper.
Oh, well, yeah. Must be true.
It must be true. They also are members of the 500 Club, which is an elite club made up of people who have been on the AST podcast, and their episodes have attracted an audience of over 500 people between YouTube and audio. And so we are thrilled to have both of them back for what's going to be a fantastic, hopefully, conversation. The topic again is the environment. It's imminent environmental catastrophe. It's the ethical, moral and legal implications of radical social action if that occurs. Let's begin with you, Cathy. If you could speak to us a little bit about the current state of play vis-a-vis our ecological future.
All right. Well, thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. I want to start by saying I'm not really a climate expert. I do have a research interest in climate issues related to business ethics, and I have a lot of psychological, emotional, and spiritual angst and grief around our climate catastrophe. I also, as you introduced me, I have a Catholic background, but I think a lot of what I'll say through the podcast can definitely be transferable to other churches as well as to other religions. So I'll start by saying the future of human civilization and the ecosystems that support it are in jeopardy, full stop. So despite the Trump administration, well, Donald Trump in particular, wanting to reboot the debate on climate, the debate is over. I don't like quoting Arnold Schwarzenegger too often, but he was one of the people who was quoted as using the 98-2 analogy. So if you take your sick child to a doctor and 98 doctors say your child is sick, but there's something I can do about it, and then 2 doctors say, your kid's fine, you don't have to worry about anything, you're going to listen to the 98. Yeah. And that's where we are with climate, and that's where we need to be. We're a lot of what I'll say is drawn from the best evidence brought forward through science. So the climate reports, both international, the IPCC, and the Canadian report that was just released, it's not coming from Doug Ford or Donald Trump's Twitter feed. So we are at this place where we can say scientific consensus. And I don't think we need to talk too much about the impacts, the extreme weather, the melting ice, the species loss, the venting of the methane. We could go on and on, but we're seeing it now. It used to be that the media didn't report as much, slowly evolving things, but now we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. Right. This morning it was 500 tornadoes in 30 days in the Midwestern U.S., the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people from the hurricane in Mozambique last year. So we're constantly experiencing it. The floods in New Brunswick, and many other parts, and the fires in the West. So it's there. It's a day-to-day reality. So that's kind of my state of the union.
Now, that's quite a depressing tale. And you mentioned there that there is astoundingly still some resistance to this reality, which is impeding action in relation to this reality. One of the difficulties that I have, that I struggle to make sense with, is that within Roman Catholic theology there is a massive commitment to creation as in relationship with God. That relationship with God within Catholic theology is not simply that God says it is good, but God is in ontological relationship with it. Therefore, to destroy or damage the created order is to impact, in a sense, almost God's self-giving to the world. It's an incarnational God. It's a God who is involved in material reality. And Pope Francis has, you yourself are an animator for Laudato Si, has spoken about this and has made this an absolute urgent priority. And yet when pretty much 1 out of every 7 people on the planet are Roman Catholic, it doesn't seem like the energy for radical transformation on this topic is coming from that 1 billion Roman Catholics. Why is that? How do we make sense of that?
Well, so much to say. You're absolutely right. And Laudato Si, Pope Francis and his team, because we have to remember that Laudato Si was on Care for Our Common Home, the encyclical from 2015. It is a collaborative piece. It's drawing on, and I mean, you look at the references in there, right? It's drawing on our elders. It references saints, it references scholars in a variety of disciplines. So this is a very important document because it was the first encyclical to focus specifically on environment. However, we have 50 plus years of Catholic social teaching. The idea of environmental emergency was first said in, I think it was 1971. I forget which encyclical and which pope said it, but this idea of the relationship that you talk about, that to sin against nature is to sin against God. This is in our idea of creation. We're co-creators. We're not passive observers. Even when we know what's going on out there with the impact on the environment, we are co-creators, and our faith tells us we have to work on building the kingdom here and now. Even if we accept that there is a different heaven than our here and now, and we move towards that, we have to act and connect our faith to action on the here and now. So 1 billion, I mean, we can mobilize if we can somehow find a way to mobilize not just Catholics, not just Christians, people of all faith, all believers, all people of God, to say we have to step up and connect our faith to action and make some pretty radical changes. And we have to do it in the next 11 years, is what we're being told by the 98.
Yeah. It's failed to capture the Catholic imagination, though, hasn't it? I mean, like, if we were to list what are the top 5 issues that are extant among, so many Catholic communities in the world, this one's just not there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Despite the encyclical, despite decades of dialogue.
Yeah. It's curious that, if you look at the book of Genesis, it's probably the first thing that God says to us, that we're established as having stewardship over creation. We are told to care for this thing. It's the first thing that God, says to us. There are, I think, a couple of different reasons which may help explain this disconnect. One of them is that, for me, this is sort of my personal perspective, is that Catholics are subjects of modernity as well as subjects to the tradition that Francis cites in Laudato Si, and therefore we have the assumption that the natural order is somehow banal. That, if you take someone like Aquinas, someone like Hildegard of Bingen, a tree or a river or a field is for us, and we can see it and we can relate to it, but there's also a relationship between it and God which is outside of our field of vision. Therefore there's a mysteriousness to it, there's an enchantment to it which we can never know. with modernity, and I think with people like Immanuel Kant, we have to bracket that mysteriousness and work only with it for us, only with how it appears to us. Which, for Karl Marx, this makes everything in the natural order a commodity. For Marx, we have to make those kind of moves where we desacralize and disenchant the natural order before we can see it as a commodity and have the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. And so somehow we in the church, through our liturgy, through our theology, through our prayer life, have failed to resist against that. Mm-hmm. And so we need a process of reformation. We need a process of re-sacralization of the natural order, because it's very difficult to care for creation as we are called to care for creation unless we love it. Yeah. It's interesting for Thomas Aquinas, and I don't want to get too sort of esoteric here, but good is used in two different senses. It's used in the sense of analogically, so this donut is good, this coffee is good, which means it's not ontologically good in itself, but it's kind of like good. And then there's good in itself, which is God. God is good. And so therefore to say that this act of kindness or charity or cheek turning is good says that God, who is good, is ontologically present as the formal cause of this act. And so God is really present in goodness. And when God looks on creation and says that it is good, it is a sense that a sort of the letter of John and Paul will take up again and again when it says that all things come into being through him, Christ, and not one thing comes into being which does not come into being through him. You know, Justin Martyr will refer to that in the sense of the logos spermaticos, the creation comes into being through the word and is therefore marked with and infused with the word. And so therefore we love creation as we love God, because God is present to it. God is the goodness in it. And so having lost that sense and becoming prisoners to a fundamentally capitalist imagination, we struggle to reconnect with that. And then the second thing is the tragic, I think that if in 200 or 300 years we're talking about, I'm certain in 200 or 300 years we won't be talking about liberal and conservative Catholics, because either we will have overcome that polarization, or there will be no Catholic Church to speak about. Yeah. And this polarization means that everything anyone tarred with the brush of liberal says must be ultimately a sneaky ruse to try and get at us. And therefore, even if the Pope says let's care about the environment, because maybe Hillary Clinton has said it, therefore instead of saying it's okay, we say even the Pope is bad.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's and that's a real crisis.
Yeah.
How can you think of anything and what's happening, because you're involved with development and peace, and you're an animator with the global Catholic climate movement, which I imagine means that you're doing a sort of a drawing version of Laudato Si, and you're, no, I'm joking. So what are Catholics like you doing to like to assail this situation and try and help us to snap out of this nightmare?
Okay. Well, I was hoping to have the good news story towards the end of the podcast, but we can jump in here and mix up the good news and the bad news. Okay. So the global Catholic climate movement started out as a result of Laudato Si in 2015. So it was a Catholic initiated by Pope Francis, and is a global network of over 650 organizations. And at this point, I couldn't guess how many people are involved, but they have been instrumental. So, for example, last Friday, May 24th, was one of the global climate strikes, the student-led ones, the Greta initiated ones that had been going on, and there were over 100 Catholic climate strikes associated with this. So thousands of people participated in strikes all over the world. So this is one way of raising awareness, getting political attention, world leader attention, business leader attention. The GCCM is also involved in working with Catholic organizations, but other organizations as well, and getting them to divest from fossil fuels. They are, it's about prayer, awareness raising, advocacy, and it's very inspirational, especially when you are one of those Catholics who's like, why aren't we paying attention to this issue? Development and Peace as well has been instrumental in raising awareness. In 2015, the campaign was focused on climate. The next 2 years, the campaign for Development and Peace is going to be focused on Care for Our Common Home. This year coming up, the campaign will focus on Amazonia, and this is in response to the United Nations focus on the Amazon region, as well as the Papal Synod coming up in October. That will be, so now we have the first synod that is going to focus specifically on environment. And I say environment, but we don't separate eco-justice and social justice. We can't. We can't separate these things. We never have really separated these things. Again, it gets back to the political, economic, technical trying to separate things like eco-justice and social justice. But at a philosophical, at a spiritual level, these things cannot be separated. So those are some of the things that are happening. Rob, maybe you could jump in. Are you aware of other things that are going on locally or?
Well, I mean, more on the secular side, I guess. But what strikes me from what you say, Cathy, is the interesting evolution of the work of Development and Peace over the years, which is an organization I just admired from afar for so long, other than reading the stuff. But putting together the environment piece and the social justice piece, and when you look at what Development Peace has been doing, it just makes sense that there's a perfect continuum there. The focus, I would say 7 to 8 years ago, on resource extraction companies. And of course the impacts they have on local populations, the impacts they have on the local environment, but then we're able now to harness their knowledge about the global scope of all of that stuff. So, it becomes an ecosystem perspective. It becomes about the Amazon region. It becomes about, in gross and scope, the developing world. And I think that kind of awareness raising is so fundamental, and yet gets so lost in the pews on Sunday. Once or twice a year we hear from Development and Peace. There might be a collection and so on, and yet at the level of your average punter who's putting their envelope in the collection plate, it's peripheral in a sense. It's almost, I don't want to say virtue signaling because it's not the right phrase, but we're made comfortable by the fact that, yes, there is an organization doing that good work that I guess we should do. I guess it's good.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just go back to the Amazon focus because for the viewers and the listeners, the Amazon being the lungs of the planet and being a particular region, and for a number of reasons it makes sense to focus on the Amazon, the lungs, literally lungs of the planet issue. And then there are also the large numbers of indigenous peoples that live in South America in these countries, and as well that there's so many people living in these countries that are the defenders of the earth. So they're the ones, unlike a lot of us, they're out there, they're protesting, they're picketing, they're raising their voices, they're praying, they're doing these things. There's a group of 80,000, I think it is, connected to REPAM, which is the network in South America, and GCCM is working with them leading up to this synod in October. And you have these people that in Colombia last year, 120 human rights activists were murdered. These are the people that are working to defend the earth, these people in the global south that are the ones being most impacted by climate catastrophe. And that's the other thing. One of the things that we use, the language that we use, the euphemism, we sanitize. So we talk about climate change. We don't. You don't hear as much about climate chaos, emergency, catastrophe, and yet on the good. Here, I'll switch to good news again. So we have 65 million people now have essentially declared a state of climate emergency. And half of that is England, Ireland, and Scotland. You'll be glad to know, David, for Ireland's role in that. And there might be a David Attenborough connection there. I don't know. But here in Canada, 30 municipalities this spring have declared this emergency, and I guess it's still being debated in Parliament. So there is this recognition, but and one other thing I forgot to mention locally was we have in our diocese, we have an eco-justice group. It's the St. Caterio Eco-Justice Group, and it's being hosted, sponsored by the Franciscans of Halifax. So if anyone's interested in connecting with them, they can connect through the Franciscans to get involved with that, or volunteer with Development and Peace. So we're especially looking for young people, young adults, 20 to 40, because we're finding, again, we're losing a lot of our youth in the churches, but I think this is a way that maybe we can engage some of our youth.
One of the things which I think is important to focus on, in addition to the social, the legal, the macro level, is the personal. And what I mean by this is that so many of our ethical and moral decisions occur in milliseconds and occur at the level of desire. And so, do I desire this, to eat this? Do I desire to bathe like this? Do I desire to travel like this? Do I desire to purchase this? All these desires are reflexes, in a sense. And if you have enough people who are subject to these desires, which are being triggered by advertising and by the machinery of global capitalism, we have a juggernaut that we can stop through legislation or through policy. We can try, but we'll always be a sort of fighting ourselves a wee bit. One of the challenges that we have, therefore, is to shape how we experience the world, how we live in it, and how we desire. And I think this is one of the challenges that we have in our congregations. And so many of the people who are watching and listening will be leaders of congregations and leaders in congregations. And absolutely, we have a few weeks of the year where we'll focus on it and we'll bring in development and peace and things like that. But within our daily and weekly liturgies, how are we working to shape selves who can desire differently in the world, and can love the created order to such an extent that we will desire differently and therefore act differently. That's always been the great hope within Catholic Christianity, is that we don't simply have to legislate such that people will act in contrast to their desires, but that it may be possible to shape desires so that, in the words of Augustine, they can love and do what they wilt. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one of the challenges, that I like to incorporate this and to see liturgy, to see Eucharist, to see worship, to see all these things as an act of resistance against the tyranny of the banal, against the idea that material stuff is banal. The Eucharist should be the ultimate resistance against that, because it takes something which is visibly as banal as possible, a wafer, and says it's the most enchanted thing in the universe. What then a tree? What then a river? What then a lake? And so I think working on a daily basis as part of our prayer lives, as part of our liturgy lives, as part of our worship lives, this should be front and center of the new evangelization, I think. If it is to be a renewal of small c Catholic Christianity, it has to be a renewal in contrast to the dualism and instrumentalist rationality of modernity, which has in many ways fueled these problems. And so I'd like to see the kinds of communities that the people who are watching and listening leading begin to understand themselves as communities of resistance over and against this emergency and chaos, and incorporating that into their daily lives, into their prayer patterns, into their worship, into how they shower, what products they use, how they shape their how they shape their way to desire. Because in addition to to social change legislated by bodies, we also hopefully need to change selves who can live differently into a different world. And that's something that I very much would like to see on the ground as part of the new evangelization, as part of parish restructuring, as part of liturgy and worship on Sundays at United Churches and Anglican churches, and because again, this compartmentalization of environmental issues as liberal or progressive issues, like that's a product of a modern pathology that we can't have any truck with.
And it requires what you're suggesting. I mean, I think is it's the way forward. It requires a level of formation that we don't have anymore. That we lost, and the new evangelization is almost the second step. The first step is getting the fire relit, which is happening. Which is happening in pockets. I'm very involved with divine renovation in many of its incarnations, particularly out of St. Benedict, and just re-energizing the spark within people to renew their relationship with God and to begin to want to evangelize. And that, creating that impulse. Now, how you create that impulse, I think you can create it. There can be any number of inputs. There can be organized church, literal community things, or it can be organizations that take on causes that are within our own scope, and relighting that fire. That's going to lead to formation, which is going to lead to the reconceptualizing of our relationship with the world in that way. But we're so impoverished now, certainly in this part of Canada, which is all I can speak to authoritatively. Our theology is impoverished, our formation is impoverished, our sense of ourselves as Catholic community is impoverished. And I'm sure lots of episodes of this podcast have spoken to to that sort of thing, and it's a concern I think we all have in the church. But that level of formation is only going to emerge from that renewal activity that fortunately is happening right now.
I agree 100%. I did a little bit of research going back 10 years, and out of 462 media releases from the CCCB, the Catholic bishops in Canada, 2 addressed the topic of environment. Out of 20 CCCB-specific pastoral letters, there was 1, and it was in response to a United Nations International Year of the Planet Earth. There's a responsive element rather than proactive. So, Rob, you talk about lighting the fire and having that be the first step. And then in the annual plenaries in the past 10 years, there was no focus. Hopefully with the synod that things will trickle down. And in 30 letters from the Halifax Yarmouth Archbishop to the people over the past 5 years, none focused on environment. So you're both absolutely right. It's not a pastoral priority. It's not a priority for faith formation. It's not well integrated into catechism. And again, in pockets, in some places, it really is. And I hope, you mentioned St. Benedict's, I hope at St. Benedict's that social and eco-justice is a pastoral priority, and it's finding its way into faith formation and into the catechism classes of adults and youth. So I went to the Kairos regional meetings were held last month, and they talked about, there's a theme running through their meetings of becoming allies to those who are core to the struggle. And I think this is it. I mean, again, it's core to our faith that the people in the global south are, we're talking hundreds of thousands of displaced people, and the numbers are predicted to just keep growing.
Many apologies. We slightly ran over in that first half. But the point you were making there, Cathy, I think warrants repeating. I didn't know that the majority of refugees are climate refugees. That's shocking, and I think indicates precisely the level of catastrophe that we're working with.
Okay, and I don't have a source for that. It's just more of what I'm reading about the refugees coming out of places like Syria and the conflict that contributed to that, the droughts, the drought in places like Nigeria, other parts of Africa, that is driving people, forcing people to move to other locations. The hundreds of thousands of people I mentioned displaced by the hurricane in Mozambique. Yeah. So even a lot of what's happening in South and Latin America with people migrating, it's because of climate-related impacts that are driving. There are other reasons for forced migration, obviously wars that might not be related to climate impacts, but you have this situation where you have people who are forced to leave, and the numbers are only going to be increasing if we buy into, again, the 98% of scientists who are telling us this.
It's a point that's constantly made. Ian Kershaw makes this. William Shirer made it in his classic Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. But without the Wall Street crash, there's no Hitler. That it requires social upheaval, it requires economic crisis in order to rise up the kind of horrific forces that lead to a Hitler. And one of the shadows of the very, very near future is that increased climate-based catastrophe, which will lead to economic crises, which will lead to crises in migration, create the conditions for horror. So that's really what we're facing into. No matter what we do, we can't completely overcome that. And so even though our focus needs to be on loving the environment for the environment's sake, and I think it's one of the and again, I don't want to take too much time because I want to focus very much on the question of ethics and legality here. But there's a constant refrain in the Hebrew Bible. I'm thinking here of the book of Daniel. I'm thinking here of the book of Job. On what do you do if there is no good can emerge from it? I think it's Jesus is most the suffering servant of Isaiah when he has that moment on the cross where this isn't simply a strategy to win. This is loving God and loving the good no matter what, because that's who I am. And of course for Anselm in his classic Cur Deus Homo, that's how salvation happens. It is the book of Job. Is there someone who will love God for God's sake, not as a strategy to get to heaven, not as a strategy because it'll win, not for virtue signaling, but even if, Daddy, why have you abandoned me? Even if that love is there. And so too, can we become the kind of people who will love God and love the created order, not necessarily as a strategy to win, but simply because that is good, And that may be becoming more and more the issue at hand, certainly for theology, because as you say, we are seeing crisis not in the future but now, and this crisis, I think, raises some moral, ethical, and legal questions that, Rob, you have been wondering about and thinking about, and I haven't heard anyone apart from you think about these kind of issues, and they're fascinating questions. Can you introduce that topic and share some of those with us?
Sure. And I think it's a pretty simple starting point, which is that the kind of catastrophic change that we're seeing, that Cathy has so effectively laid the groundwork about, is going to, even if it's us loving God and loving the earth for its own sake, or purely secular ideas about self-preservation, it is going to beget resistance. Yeah. There's going to be resistance. In fact, there's resistance already. In the developing world, we're seeing a lot of protest, as Cathy was indicating, also a lot of legal actions taken against resource extraction companies, framed through breach of human rights, but that's completely enmeshed in the environmental capacity of these companies, destructive capacity. Yeah. So there's legal resistance going on. There are laws being passed municipally, nationally, even internationally, lots of law being generated. My question that I've been exploring, though, is premised on looking at all of that and saying, in the 11 and a bit years that we have, is that going to be effective? And I think there will be a growing concentration of people who say no. We can look at that objectively and say, great, well-motivated, some of it is good, not going to work, not going to prevent catastrophe within the time frame that we have. the kind of resistance that's going to create is, I think, that the closest analogy is to terrorism.
Right.
Is to people. I mean, that's. I guess I want to use that dramatic word.
Yep.
You could say civil disobedience. Right. We could go to Gandhi. We could go to MLK, and we could look at that whole end of things. But civil disobedience has. I don't want to say baggage, but it's peaceful. It's philosophically peaceful. I think if you look at it in its entirety, I think what we're going to see is people faced with very stark realities, saying, I'm going to resist, and I'm going to resist in not a passive way. I'm going to resist in an active way. I'm going to break the law. I am going to destroy property. I'm going to actually take measures that can only be construed as violent, but with some sort of ultimate justification on the fact that if we don't do something, literally we're facing extinction of species, extinction of part of the human population, extinction of ecosystems. And I think there are lots of interesting legal, ethical, philosophical, and theological questions to be asked and I don't want to say answered because that seems like an awfully big task, but to be explored in this setting, because I really see it as inevitable. I think we're going to get, I wonder why it hasn't happened, to be honest. Like, where are all the 22-year-old kids reading Murray Bookchin and all the environmental anarchism stuff and saying, I got to go blow up a coal plant? Where are they? They're playing video games or they're on Facebook? I don't know, because in the 70s, that's what we saw. Motivated by good impulses or not, there was action. There was that kind of action, which we would construe as terrorism. Yeah. And I guess one way of framing the question is it terrorism when it's taken as an active measure of resistance against literal planetary extinction?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to advocate for anyone to go out and blow up any coal plants.
No one's doing it.
Maybe me.
But I do agree with you. I think we're seeing, again, these pockets of resistance. We're seeing a lot of resistance coming from the global south. I think in many cases, they're the people that are witnessing things more directly, and so it's that Jean Valjean, I'm starving, I'm going to steal some bread, I'm going to... So they're in that place. We're also seeing I think it was 1.5 million young people, definitely supported with some adults, at the climate marches on May 24th. So you're seeing, and there would have been people who didn't get out. I admit I didn't go because it was rainy and cold on Friday. So I'm a wuss and I didn't go. But I think that there is a way to tap into. I've been watching the Apple podcasts on outrage and optimism. I highly recommend them. I've only listened to 3 of them, but they're very well done. So David Attenborough was interviewed in the first, and Ellie Goulding was interviewed in the one I listened to yesterday. And this idea of balancing the outrage, the moral outrage, with the optimism in believing that there is a solution, believing we can do this, how we reach into people's hearts and souls and get them to transform so that they have to see that it's radical transformation. Oh, what? I can't water my lawn anymore, and I have to start biking instead of, and I might not be able to fly south this winter, and I don't have to fashion up every week. I mean, there's that real resistance to that it is disordered, the way, and this is, David, what you were getting at with the banal and our disordered consumption lifestyles. And like how we tap into transforming so that more people have what Greta Thunberg has and can inspire people to say, let's eat less meat, because we know that meat is pushing meat globally to get people in other parts of the world eating more and more meat, which is what the large meat companies are doing now. To get people inspired to change what they're doing, how we tap into that, how we hold into that. And I think it speaks directly to our faith. So we have these virtues, these cardinal virtues, these theological, faith and hope, that's the optimism piece. We have to believe that we can be co-creators. And then you look at your cardinal virtues, and you look at the role of prudence, and prudence is so helpful in saying, okay, so I'm being politicized and polarized, and because I'm pro-life, then, I can ignore or make fun of climate action because my favorite pro-life politician says that that's okay. So how we get people to see that these are not politicized, polarized things that we're talking about. Anyways,
I think that the Frankfurt School offer some interesting answers, potential answers to your second question, the where are the young people. One of the crises that the Frankfurt School have in the middle and latter parts of the 20th century is, again, where are the young people? The assumption is that radical, unjust Western European capitalist society would produce a group of largely young people who would be traumatized by the injustice of the capitalist system and would rise up. And of course the proletariat would rise up. Why isn't it happening? Why is there not dominoes going across Europe? And they developed a couple of theses in relation to this, and one of them is pseudo-individualization, whereby capitalism gives young people, so if you can imagine a pressure cooker, and young people are just outraged by injustice, and the proletariat are outraged by injustice, and it's a pressure cooker building up, and then capitalism says, well, you can express your rage by this kind of music, and so rock and roll emerges as a form of protest, and punk emerges as a form of protest, and if you have your hair cut like this, or if you get your nose pierced like this, then you are sticking it to the man, and you are expressing that. And this is like a sort of just releasing the pressure on a pressure cooker. And the genius of it is you buy the music, you buy the haircut, you buy the piercings, and so it co-opts you into it. And I think that we have a similar thing today, in that we have, in one sense, the most socially activated young people ever, but they're largely, well, not, this is a horrific generalization, but so many are activated on Instagram in their defense of right-thinking, essentially bourgeois causes, which establishes them as an absolute rebel, because they'll sit with their Apple MacBook, wearing their Uggs, drinking fair trade coffee, and therefore they're on the front lines.
It says the idea of clicktivism, click activism.
Exactly, clicktivism, and it functions as that release valve. And I think that we certainly shouldn't discount the moral coherence of actions which flout some moral oughts in the favor of other moral oughts. Christianity has done this from the beginning. So, for example, Jesus, when he's heading into Jerusalem, steals a donkey. This is private property. That guy's going to come back. What the hell? I got a donkey. It's a nice donkey. It's my donkey. And the next thing, this thug comes in and steals the donkey.
Master needs it.
Yeah, master needs it. Sorry, but there's a God thing happening here, and it trumps it. And there's a sense in which that living in the world, and Augustine, and I'm not a fan of just war theory at all, but Augustine's principle is that war is never good. It's always immoral. It always transgresses. It always transgresses against the good. And so hitting someone or shooting someone is always an act of violence, and therefore it's an act which lowers the presence of the Holy Spirit in you. It's a problem. And yet soldiers can be heroic precisely because they endanger their eternal souls in order to avoid essentially, vulnerable people being killed. So for Augustine and for Aquinas and for Luther, for these giants of the Christian tradition, it is never morally okay to kill in self-defense. Never. But it can be morally just to kill to avoid a greater horror happening. And this is axiomatic in the Christian tradition. Of course, it's amplified with the notion of holy war, which starts to seep in at the time of the Crusades, that a kind of God wills it, that God can not just tolerates it, but God wills it. And so if we're in a situation where the defense of the created order and the defense of human life on the planet requires acts of blowing up power plants, morally it would be very, very difficult, I think, from the Christian point of view, to make an argument that this is not morally justified. The modern conflation of morality and legality, which again I attribute to Kant, sorry for my constant anti-Kantianism, but that's a real problem. That's a real problem, and part of the work of evangelization and renewing Christianity in the modern West is a sort of ripping us apart from that and realizing that what is morally good and what is legal are two completely different things. It's one of the things that I have problems with in the pro-life movement, that their fixation is on changing state laws. What's that got to do with anything?
All within the peculiar Catholic obsession with using the criminal law to manage things that are not appropriately managed by the criminal law.
Exactly.
And yet, it's the criminal law that has, it's got analogs, I think, to the idea of having to do moral balancing. Because we think of criminal law as a set of prohibitions, and if you break those rules, you go to jail. But within the criminal law are notions of defense, and they're based around two poles, essentially, justification and excuse. Some defenses are called justification in law. Despite the fact that you broke the law, you were legally justified in doing so. So the best example there is the defense of self-defense. I killed that guy or I injured that guy because he was going to kill me or because he was going to harm you or someone else. And we say, and it's, the dichotomy is interesting. With justifications, we say that was a right thing you did. It's not just that we say it's okay that you broke the law in that situation. We say you're not guilty of breaking the law because in that situation, there is and this is where morality seeps in, there's a moral justification for what you did.
Yeah.
The other pole is excuse. And excuse is a set of defenses that realizes the fragility of human behavior, the pressure that people are under in situations, and takes account of it. Because criminal law is very human, it's very blood and guts in its origin. So and the best example there is what's called the defense of necessity. In the situation, there was nothing I could do except break the law because of the pressures that were created by the facts of the situation. An example would be, I drove drunk, but I drove drunk to get away from a guy who was trying to kill me or trying to sexually assault me and that sort of thing. So and we say there, not that you were justified, you still did a morally wrong thing, but you are excused in that situation. And so this is where my thinking has been, because that we would say that, that's the criminal law and it's secular, it's creatures of the state, but obviously it's informed historically by theological notions, by things that Augustine would have recognized, ironically by things that Kant would have recognized as well. And my prediction and the work I'm interested in doing now is to look forward and say, we're going to have to confront this on the idea level, because both of those kinds of defenses are now, they're very constrained. Like the law makes them quite, because you can't have people going around breaking the law and saying, it's okay that I broke the law. So they're very tightly constrained, but we're going to need to take the ideas that underpin them, I think, and deal with the fact that we're going to get very active, violent, this is my prediction again, we're going to get very active, violent resistance that breaks the law out of a sense of necessity, out of a sense of preservation, literally, of the species. And it won't be enough to say, you broke the law, we'll throw you in jail, even though we admire what you did, because we might get systemic level movements. I mean, there's so much that may come.
Can I pick up, that's great, Rob. I want to pick up on what you're talking about with the justifications and the excuses. And from where I come from, I don't look at the legal piece, except it's how it connects to the moral piece. And of course, David, you connect to the theological piece. But the idea of the moral disengagement and where it gets, like it's another layer of complexity added on here, is that you have these ways of disengaging through justifications and excuses that are connected to messages that in some cases they're what's being communicated through the pastoral plan, the faith formation. In some cases it's what's not being communicated, but it's dulling the awareness of the faithful in many cases. So you have people who will say that it's too big. I'm just going to lift it up to God and say, God will take care of it. Or it's too big for one person to handle. I can't do anything, so I'm just going to pray. And you have, I heard a priest once connect Hurricane Sandy, the landfall, the location was God's way of saying that there's too much evil in New York City and Wall Street in particular. And when you have messages like that that are communicated, that shift blame, that make it so I don't have to deal with this because God has a hand in this. He's either punishing us or he'll take care of it for us. And this is not our teaching, and yet it's communicated sometimes through politicians who are connected to a particular idea of Christianity, but it's not found in any of the teaching of our Christian churches. So
people give up their moral agency as a result, and their divine agency in a sense. How we're called to be the hands and feet.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it sounds dramatic and presumptuous to say I might be an instrument of God, but I might actually be if I hook up with an organization to resist climate change. If I do something as radical as blowing up a coal plant, that might be. You know, we need to be able to explore that. But as you say, we're anesthetized instead by the messages that are conveyed.
Absolutely. Either the messages that are conveyed or that we're not hearing the messages that need to be conveyed. Yeah. So I just wanted to pick up on something that you had mentioned, David, with the idea of heroes. And then, Rob, you had questioned why youth aren't getting involved. And then, David, you had commented on the role of social media. And there are a couple of other things that I thought about there. One is that if Doug Ford tweets that carbon taxing causes recessions, or Donald Trump says that wind turbines cause cancer, and these things go viral, then you have these other, based on Facebook or whatever algorithms, and you have these other science, evidence-based things about what's going on in the world, that the youth that are being bombarded. So you're going to get this, oh my goodness, what can we do with this? Or they're going to be influenced by these messages that are going viral, even if they're based on lies. And the other thing is that they will also be bombarded by the technological and economic entrepreneurial heroes. So we have our Bezos and our Bransons that are going to get their vacuum cleaners and they're going to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. Or, well, if that doesn't work, don't worry, we'll fly you all into the sky. So instead of looking to the heroes that are these activists that are being murdered in Colombia, or the Greta Thunbergs who are inspiring millions of youth around the world to get involved, this is part of it, that what they're being bombarded with is influencing them as well. And in some cases, I think it's leading to great angst and depression and anxiety. And there's evidence of that.
That's an interesting point, because I think if there is a mainstream conservative position, it tends to be that, yes, there is climate change, but technology will solve it.
Yeah.
And whatever the coherence or incoherence of that perspective, I would strongly argue that that's absolutely impermissible for a Christian to that's our responsibility towards the environment is irrespective of whether technology can solve it or not. And to me, it's a bit like, because again, I think instrumentalist rationality and a technological hegemony has precisely given us this problem. It's a bit like a knife has given you a wound, and you think, I'm going to use the knife to cut that wound out, And so we're doubling down on the thing that gave us. It's a kind of like a sort of smoking our way out of cancer, And so assuming that instrumentalist rationality and technological approaches, which are two of the four horse people of the environmental catastrophe, will lead us to salvation, is at best it's idolatry, and it's fundamentally a victory for the kind of rationality that has nullified coherent Christianity and led us to this situation. So Christians, I think, strongly need to resist that. I think that what you both have been saying, and in relation to the kinds of action that's necessary, I'm really intrigued and will continue to think about the things that you've been suggesting, Rob, in relation to whether the time is coming or has come when people can see certain acts of violence against machinery, buildings, etc., as coherent. That to me is intriguing, and I think that I would like to say that in some senses, in one sense, that's the opposite of terrorism. Growing up in Ireland, there's a huge amount of terrorism, and in terrorism you'd have a bomb in a bar or a pub or a chip shop or whatever, and the place that the bomb was placed was precisely irrelevant. It is not that the IRA are waging a war on fish and chips. It is that the IRA wanted to produce terror, and so they were attempting to produce terror, and the actual location for the act of violence was completely irrelevant. The kinds of actions which you're discussing are the opposite of that. That the role is not to produce terror at all. It is precisely to assail an object of violence which is killing, which is leading to the deaths of hundreds of millions of people and species and perhaps even creation itself. And the goal is not to cause fear or confusion. There's plenty of fear and confusion already. There is terror already. It's a response to terror rather than an act of terror.
That's right.
It seems like a cold-headed, rational act of resistance in preservation of the created order. And so I think definitely whether it's morally coherent or not might require further analysis, but I think it definitely ought to be on the table, and the fact that it is governed by the law of the land currently, or some logic of private property, to assert private property as the most significant moral object, again, would testify to the triumph of capitalism.
And it's fundamentally inadequate.
Yeah.
Although, I should say, I think important caveat, discussing, yes, I'm not advocating for any of this stuff. I mean, I'm an officer of the court, I'm sworn to uphold the rule of law. What I'm doing is predicting, seeing this. But we're going to be confronting, legal problems, and of course, morality suffuses our criminal law.
Yeah.
And bouncing off what you were saying earlier, David, it's interesting, the definition of terrorism in international law that's trickled down to the country level is that what's considered a terrorist act is not necessarily something designed to inspire terror. That would be one motivation, but that it be designed to change government policy in some way. Okay. So we're going to have to confront the criminal prohibitions on terrorism, whoever we is, that we're going to confront it in the court system, or those who choose to undertake such acts will confront it. But there's a clash coming, I think, is what I'm feeling.
I think you're 100%. And do you know of any thinkers who are engaging that apart from yourself? Because I think that's something that many of us, that I and many of our listeners and viewers would be interested in reading more about.
Well, that'll be for another podcast. That's my next research step.
Fantastic. I look forward to it. Cathy, do you have any final comments and thoughts or even suggestions for people who could say, okay, blowing up power plants probably not my thing. Is there anything else I could do?
Okay, well, definitely coming up in the fall. So the season of creation begins on September 1st, and this is a day of prayer for for everyone on creation. And the season of creation goes until the Feast of St. Francis on October 4th. So the next global climate strikes, the student-led ones, are taking place the week of September 20th to 27th. So definitely here in Halifax, we will have a climate strike connected with the Development and Peace, probably working with the Global Catholic Climate Movement, working with the St. Kateri Eco-Justice Group to get as many Catholic people out as we can, but we definitely want to invite all people of all faiths and even no faith to come out to participate in those climate strikes when they take place. So that's something that you can start planning for now. You can contact one of those organizations or groups, and that would be one way to get involved. I want to read one quote that I had here. It's a U.S. politician, Rick Santorum, former U.S. Senator, and he said, "The church should stay out of climate change debate and focus on what they're really good at, which is theology and morality." And what I think we're really trying to get at in this podcast is that we have to stop decoupling and disengaging these things and to say, what are you talking about, Rick Santorum, and all you other politicians out there who are saying similar things, and other world leaders as well, in that the climate change debate goes hand in hand with theology and morality. Yeah. So I just want to conclude by saying that, this is the season. This is a season for ramping up the prayer, the prophetic action, the leadership, and doing what we can. And this has to be communicated from the pulpit, from the pews, from all the people of God. And we have to get radical, and this is the time to do it. Thanks.
I'm just fighting words. Cathy Driscoll, Rob Currie, thank you so much. And thank you, our viewers and listeners, for joining us in this podcast. Please do comment below if you're on YouTube. I'm sure that you will have lots to say, and we really welcome those thoughts, whether they're supportive or if they're critical. Please do join in the conversation, because that's what this podcast is in the service of. It's in the service of hosting and encouraging a conversation. So Cathy, Rob, thank you so much, and thank you for your time.
Thanks,
Thank
David.
you, David.
My pleasure.